Good evening, I'm David Nicholas, and next on CMU Public Television, we sit down with the new congressman from Michigan's 4th District as John Moolenaar joins me next on Capitol Report.
Welcome to Capitol Report, a weekly discussion with your elected officials on the issues and concerns that affect you.
Just about a year ago brought the unexpected announcement of the retirement of long-serving 4th District Congressman Dave Camp, former state representative, and then Senator John Moolenaar won the GOP nomination in the primary last August and then the general election in November. We welcome him for the first time as he represents Mid-Michigan in Washington. Congratulations, Congressman, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you, David. It's good to be back with you.
You've known, obviously, Dave Camp for many years, and as you begin this first term for the seat that he held for many years, we begin with sort of that transition type question and wonder what some of the top priorities of his are those that you are continuing into this first term.
Sure. Well, Dave Camp, no one can replace Dave Camp. He served as our congressman for 24 years, fantastic work as the Ways and Means chairman, has been a leader on tax reform. And that's something that will continue in this session. We have a new chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Paul Ryan, who will continue to build upon the work that Dave Camp did in advocating for a fairer, simpler, flatter tax code for all Americans.
And we know that as the chair of that committee, that he had risen to a point where, other than the opposition from the opposing party in the Senate, many of those tax reform proposals had been put forth with that goal of tax reform. What indication do you have, or maybe some personal contact with Congressman Ryan as to what is being carried forward from that Camp platform and what's being done now to build upon that?
Well, we've already worked on some of the tax extenders that are tax credits that help farmers and small businesses invest and be able to deduct some of that investment. And that's something that Dave Camp worked on, and we've already passed that. We've already made some changes to Obamacare that would go through the Ways and Means Committee that allow the 40-hour work week as opposed to the 30-hour work week, where people were losing hours and income because they were considered a liability because they didn't have insurance and the company couldn't afford to pay for that insurance. And so we've also eliminated some of the barriers to hiring veterans. That also went through the Ways and Means Committee. But for a broader, comprehensive tax reform, we'll need a bipartisan, bicameral effort that the president signs on to, and that will take some time. One of the strengths Dave had is that he worked very closely with Senator Max Baucus, who was the Democratic chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. They had worked together, and unfortunately, Senator Baucus was appointed the ambassador to China, chose not to run for re-election, and as a result, that wasn't able to get done. So hopefully in this session, the president has talked about it. Paul Ryan is working on it, and I'm optimistic that some good things can happen.
What about with now also a GOP majority that was elected in the Senate as well, and with Republicans in the legislative side of things, and then the president from his side of the aisle? Where do you see potentially that room for getting it done, governing, and getting some of these things done, as opposed to perhaps some of the partisan politics still coming into play?
Well, I think there will always be differences in viewpoints. We'd like to see in the Republican side tax reform that leads to growth, job creation, and there could be some disagreements between our party and the Democratic Party. On issues like the authorization for use of force, we need to be together on that as Americans' foreign policy and making sure we defeat ISIS. So there will be issues. The XL pipeline passed both the House and the Senate with bipartisan support. The president doesn't support that. We need to make sure that we advance our goals in the House, make sure that we put an agenda before the American people that works on the challenges we face as a country. But ultimately, the Senate is going to have to decide what their agenda is. And then, of course, the president has his agenda. And I hope there will be points where we can all come to an agreement that would be good policy for the American people.
And with the contact through the course of the campaign for state office, and then obviously on the congressional campaign trail, what are some of the top priorities that John Moolenaar brings to this term, obviously representing your own point of view, the things that you would like to see get done?
Well, I definitely want to keep the focus on jobs. We want to make sure in Michigan and throughout our country there are jobs. That's why I supported the XL pipeline, because it would create American jobs. It would help grow our economy without adding to the debt. That's why I support some of the regulatory reform we've done that, penalize small businesses and farmers. One of the concerns was the EPA was over-regulating the area of water, mud puddles on farmers' property, and we needed to make sure that those rules were changed. So we're going to continue, tax reform, regulatory relief. I also serve on the Agricultural Committee, and we want to make sure that we have exports for our products, agricultural products overseas. And so there are a number of trade policies that we'll be working on, and I believe we can work with the President in a bipartisan way to get things done so that our products made here in Michigan can be exported overseas.
We see this often when we have a situation with a minority party, or in this case now with the divided government. And I've seen this, at least in my time, reporting on such things that there can be the so-called party of no. And of course, critics have already come out now looking at this dynamic that we have in Washington, saying, where is the governing going to come from? And, it's one thing to say no to some initiative that would come from the White House, and then it's another to put forth the alternative to it. So, and you've already mentioned several things on that front, and I guess we'll start with the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. This has been one that has been scrutinized an awful lot from the standpoint of, okay, you don't like the president's plan, but then what is the plan? So as we look at where it is in terms of implementation now and moving forward, what is already the talk within the GOP caucus, House and Senate side, as to what that full plan would look like that would, if a repeal is pushed, then what?
Well, I support a full repeal. We actually voted on that in the House, passed it to the Senate. We don't know what the Senate will do. The President likely would not sign that. At the same time, the President himself has already changed Obamacare over 20 times unilaterally because of many of the problems associated with it. We've also passed the legislation that I've referred to earlier that was penalizing employers for hiring veterans and for keeping people working 40 hours a week. So we've made those recommended changes. If we were able to start and build a foundation for our health care in America, I would start on a patient-centered program that drives down the costs of health care. When you think of Obamacare, simply adds subsidies and more funding into the system without driving down the costs. Unfortunately, that is not a sustainable plan. And the Supreme Court will also be taking action sometime this summer on whether or not the subsidies to federal exchanges are actually legal. And that affects 26 different states, including Michigan. So we do need to have an alternative, a patient-centered, market-driven healthcare system that keeps costs down, provides maximum consumer choice, competitive health insurance, and also drives down costs like the liability costs that doctors are penalized in providing unnecessary services simply so they don't get sued. So those are things we can all work on. The other thing we need to make sure we do is offer incentives to patients for healthy behaviors, because if you have a health savings account, a medical savings account, and you can save those dollars, you're going to be more interested in preventive type medicine, healthier behaviors, because it drives down your costs and you benefit from that.
You mentioned too the Islamic State and the authorization of use of force, and this we've seen again played out different dynamics depending on who's in the White House, who's in the Congress at the time in terms of that party control. Where do we stand in terms of a united front, everyone being on the same page in terms of addressing the threat, and yet are we, yes or no, taking the proper steps in terms of following the protocol for addressing the problem?
Well, it's important that we take action and that we take appropriate action in Congress with the authorization of force. We've seen ISIS growing. They are gaining momentum. They are recruiting. They are active in Iraq and Syria, now in Libya. We see the expansion of their efforts. Unfortunately, we haven't had a strategy from the White House to deal with this threat. The airstrikes are simply a maintenance kind of thing. It's not something that has been successful in really degrading and stopping ISIS. We need to work with our international partners. Israel, we have Prime Minister Netanyahu coming to speak to a joint session of Congress in the next couple of weeks. The King of Jordan has really taken a lead. King Abdullah is taking a leadership role in the Arab world, and we see that Egypt is stepping up, and we need to work with an international coalition to fight this threat, because it's a growing threat, and it's something that, as Americans, we need to be decisive. The other thing is some of the challenges the President had in his authorization of force proposal, a timeline of 3 years, and said that he wouldn't put boots on the ground. And to me, that's speaking to a political audience that says, here's what we would maybe prefer. The challenge here is that we don't want to send a message to our enemies that we are only willing to defeat them if it takes 3 years. We need to send them the message that we will defeat them. We also don't want to limit the use of force in such a way that we somehow would send a message that we aren't fully committed to defeating our enemy. So those are things we'll be working on in the weeks ahead as we authorize the use of force, and I believe at the end of the day, America will stand firm and be one voice.
The President also has moved forward with executive actions when it comes to immigration, and you were among those that spoke out in support of the federal judge ruling or sending down the decision to put a delay on that. Another issue where the power of the presidency, the role of the Congress, and that intersection there, where do we stand as far as bringing folks up to date in terms of the issue itself, and how would you proceed? Sure.
Well, I think it's important that we fully fund our Homeland Security operations. And so in the House, we passed a bill. My understanding is that the Senate will be taking that up once again. Now, unfortunately, there's a filibuster going on where the Democrats won't allow it to be debated on the Senate floor. And that's a problem, because at the end of the day, whether the Senate bill is different than the House bill, we need to have an agreement on funding Homeland Security moving forward. In the House bill, we put in language that we didn't believe it was appropriate to fund actions that were deemed not legal. We want to fund legal operations of the Homeland Security apparatus. So
how do you convey that message to people then that say that you want it fully funded, and then, I mean, people are especially critics will start
Sure.
Splitting hairs on this to say, well, you say you're fully funding it, believe we should, and yet this is an action that you won't. Right. How do you convey to them the message? Well, or this is the chance, I guess, to convey the message
Sure.
as to why fund this but not
Yes. Well, just to clarify, the judge in Texas, the federal judge, has put a hold on the president's unilateral actions on immigration. So right now, those are on hold. So I don't understand why we would put funding in a Homeland Security bill on actions that may or may not occur. So to me, it's important that we make sure that our security is intact, that we fund all the legal operations of the Homeland Security. There is a difference of opinion on this. So my feeling is the Senate should take action. At the end of the day, they have to take some kind of action. Senator McConnell has tried to take this up 3 times. The Democrats have not allowed a debate on the bill. Why not do their own bill or do their own amendments? But simply having inaction on this is not helpful in the process at all. Differences in bills can be resolved in a conference committee and send something to the president that is negotiated through that process. But inaction in the Senate is not acceptable because we are getting up against a time frame.
How do you bring this message closer to home? Because people will, some in Michigan may say, well, we're not Arizona, we're not Texas, we're not California, so we don't see maybe the pressures on the system from the influx of populations at other parts. But yet this state, we certainly have our own border, and there is a heavy reliance through the ag industry in this state on many who would be coming here, at least in terms of seasonal work, and to work actively in that industry. So how do we, regardless of what number we put on the number of folks that may be illegally or somewhere in between in the system here, how do we come to a final solution?
Well, I think we first start with securing our borders and making sure we know who is coming across our borders, preventing anyone who is not authorized to come across the border from that. That's both a fairness issue to those who are standing in line waiting to do the process legally, as well as a national security issue. We don't want terrorists coming, or drug kingpins or gang leaders coming across our borders. So that has to be job one. Secondly, your point is we do need to improve our current immigration system in such a way that we are modernizing it, updating it, recognizing there are certain temporary workforce needs, there are certain types of visas that are required, and if there are bottlenecks in those, we need to improve those. But I think it all starts with securing the border so we know who is coming in and who isn't.
You mentioned earlier, too, the Small Business Tax Relief Act when we were talking a little bit more in terms of the tax reform. When we look at this in terms of the economics of, ag industry is going to include big business and small business, and then many other aspects of the economy in the state. What technically is in that bill, and what effect will it have for small business owners in Michigan?
Well, I think the main thing that we've been working on is an agenda that tries to recognize that businesses spend a lot of money complying with government regulations and bureaucratic red tape. And we passed legislation that would eliminate some of that red tape in a bipartisan way. And it's based on listening to businesses. One of the concerns, I talked about earlier was the waters of the U.S. Where, farmers were concerned that the EPA under a water regulatory scheme was going to start regulating the water on, the mud puddles on farmers' property, rather than focusing on other issues that they should be, like environmental cleanups or keeping Asian carp out of the Great Lakes. So it's a matter of keeping government within its appropriate scope and focusing on the things that it should do well, but not putting up barriers to job providers for hiring people or expanding operations. We also want it, through the tax code, give incentives for dollars that are overseas now being invested to come back to this country and not be penalized for bringing those dollars back.
Sean Donovan, who is the director of the Office of Management and Budget, testified recently before the House Budget Committee. You're a member there, and at issue is the funding, and I'm hoping you can help clarify this for us, the funding or how it's being spent or the dollar amount when it comes to the invasive species, Asian carp, and the impact on the Great Lakes. What took place in that hearing, and what is the progress of this ongoing issue?
Well, I was concerned, and I raised the issue because the president has proposed in his budget a $50 million cut to the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And so in committee, I had the opportunity to ask the director of the Office of Management and Budget, why they were cutting money at this crucial time when, Asian carp, the eDNA has been discovered, a city block away from the Great Lakes. And his comment was not satisfactory. His comment was, well, we haven't spent the money, so we didn't feel like it's as needed now in the next budget cycle. And, my question is, we have an urgent crisis to try and keep the Asian carp and other invasive species out of the Great Lakes. What's the bottleneck that would say that money that's been appropriated is not being spent actively, and why would we cut back funding when we have a very urgent need to address this problem? And
his contention is that the money hasn't been spent.
Right. And
it's the same Army Corps of Engineers that wanted to lengthen out the time of study before taking an active plan. And this, again, is another issue that I remember from many conversations with Congressman Camp about the timeline, and saying, if we're going to take 5 more years to study the problem, by then we're going to be overrun. We've got to take the action now. And yet there were blocks to having that action go forward. So how can OMB say money's not being spent when it's some at the same federal level that have, in a sense, put up roadblocks of their own to that money being spent?
And that's exactly it. If it's a priority, we ought to be spending the resources to get the job done as quickly as possible, because there is a clock that we're working against on this.
You mentioned, too, the vote for the Keystone XL pipeline. Closer to home, there is the stability of the line that runs under the Straits of Mackinac. Now, it is not your immediate district. It's that of your colleague, Dan Benishek, but Great Lakes, we're all in the same group on that, certainly. What is the latest in terms of the safety concerns being addressed moving forward as we look at that 60-year-old line that runs right under the Straits?
Well, I think making sure our infrastructure is adequate, making sure that it can be transported safely is of paramount importance. When you consider the options available by rail, by barge, if you look at the track record of pipelines, they have a pretty good track record, as long as they're kept up to date and made sure that they're checked and safe. So the way I view the XL pipeline, and all the studies I've seen, is that is the safest way to transport. It also relies on a reliable trading partner in Canada and helps us with our energy independence. Our energy security has much to do with our national security. And so when you consider who we rely on for our oil and gas, the oil is, you look at the trading partners, not the most stable countries in the world. And so the idea that we can become energy more self-sufficient, rely on a reliable trading partner, that to me makes sense. And at the same time, we want to make sure our natural gas in efforts in Michigan contribute to a strong and growing economy. And we can eventually, in this country, I believe, be an exporter of energy and make it a competitive advantage for our country.
If the heavier tar sands crude starts coming through that line more on a regular basis, have you been given enough assurance that right now that line is equipped to, or that they are willing to back up the infrastructure upgrades to keep that line safe for that coming through, so that there's not the environmental risk that opponents have said could be there?
I think that's a major priority, to make sure that whatever actions we take, there is, safety, the environmental considerations are addressed. And there's always a not in my backyard attitude out there, but I think if you have good science backing up then I think it's important that we move forward.
Another transit, if you will, for economic development, the I-69 caucus. You've joined in on that as well. We've just got a couple of minutes left, but I wonder what you can tell us about what you've been able to learn about the goals there and the potential economic development for the state, and really in this case with that whole corridor of the region as a whole.
Well, it's something that I just joined the caucus, so I'm looking forward to being part of it. The goals are to really make sure that the I-69 is safe, that it's kept up to date, and that there's economic development opportunities all along the way. And Michigan has a long stretch of I-69 all the way from Port Huron, and it goes all the way down to Texas and eventually down to Mexico. So there's, for trade and for goods to come from Canada, through I-69, I think that's a plus for Michigan, and we want to make sure that we're promoting that and supporting that in every way possible.
In our final minute, the 2014 Farm Bill was authored in large measure and pushed through by Michigan's now senior Senator Debbie Stabenow. She was the then chair of the House Agriculture Committee in the Senate. In sitting in the House Committee now, is there anything that needs to be done that you see, I guess the question of what's good policy in there and what might need to be changed?
That's something our committee will be working on. you know, I am working with Congresswoman or Senator Stabenow. She was one of the legislators who also raised concerns about the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative cuts in the president's proposal. There's also some work that, as part of the Farm Bill, some of the watershed issues and some funding will be coming to our region in order to promote best practices, and I think that's something that, you know, our region will benefit from in terms of really shining a light on good practices and making sure we're using those, but then also having the rest of the country adopt those good practices.
A lot already happening in just a first term, and a much bigger set of things to be concerned with on the federal level than even during your time in state government. We certainly appreciate the time in the busy schedule here as things are getting up and moving in Washington. Hope we can have you back again. And
I look forward to it. Thanks so much, David.
Thank you. And thanks for your time and attention, as always, here, too, on Capitol Report. We've been speaking with Congressman John Moolenaar, Republican from Midland, and now the new congressman for Michigan's 4th District. A reminder that within a few days of our time with you, that these are also posted to our website. You can go to WCMU.org, click on television, and then the local programs tab. You'll find the link there to Capitol Report for the programs that we have aired and soon to be joined by tonight's conversation as well. Next week, we plan to be talking with the gentleman who is one of the successors to a former seat held by Mr. Moolenaar, and that's State Representative Gary Glenn of the 98th District. That's next week on Capitol Report. For all of us here, thanks. We'll talk again.
You've been watching Capitol Report. Join us again as your elected officials speak to your concerns on current issues.